The history of energy in British Columbia. It has two genesis in my interest in this area, or three. Having taught U.S. environmental history for many years at the university, in our earlier policy, many of the curators were interested in industrial history, but giant places like Powell River are not easily fitted into a collection storage box. Industrial history tends to be on a huge scale. And because it's on a huge scale, it's not easily dealt with at the level of a small community museum. They can tell their story of place, but they can't see its provincial, its national, and its international significance. So for many of my predecessors were really interested in that area, and I am as well. I had a training in resource economies, but my interest was in the social and the environmental dimensions, but more social than environmental. That came later in my career. So I'm inheriting previous long-standing work of the museum a little bit. In our collections, there are objects that are really kind of interesting that do fit in collection boxes or maybe on warehouse pallets. So we have things like a small flashlight that's controlled through a hydrogen fuel cell and a prototype for a hydrogen fuel cell for a cell phone. It was an experiment by a BC company into miniaturization. We have a beautiful kitchen stove with a big chrome hopper on the side because it took sawdust waste from the forest industry, in which Dr. Chung is going to talk about some of the people who worked in that forest industry in her project. So it was a stove which could burn coal from the mines of Nanaimo or sawdust from the sawmills that were found on the gorge and around Victoria Harbor. We also have a wine collection, and if you're paying attention to the news, wine and wine boycotts were significant in the last couple of months. We have coal mining lamps and shovels and things like that. But really, in a social history, they connect to things like, well, I'll show you an example in my talk. All of these things, what they have in common is they connect to the social dimensions of energy. Different forms of energy that were part of the development and the history of British Columbia. All parts of the world have energy histories, and a lot of people may not know that Vaclav Semel, a professor in Manitoba, is one of Bill Gates' favorite authors, because he writes about the history of energy systems. And what this project is about is presenting a really interesting, for me, hopefully for others, regional case study of energy around the world, but as seen through the lens of British Columbia. Now, in contemporary society, they'll go, oh, it's an environmental book and it's a blast about pipelines and Greenpeace and this sort of thing. That's not really what I'm interested in. An academic called Pior looked at these systems and looked at industrialism and said, you know, industrial revolutions aren't necessarily revolutions. It's not that one regime completely replaces the other one. There are legacies, and it's complex, and there are layers and things that survive. So to give you a small example of something that survives in our collection, we have a jeweler's bench. Jeweler's benches, despite electrical tools, have not changed since the 12th century. They're still the same shaped table. They still have a lot of similar hand tools and so forth. So there's a medieval legacy there, which is found in the modern industrial world. And the same idea, I'm sort of looking at that idea in energy systems. Early historians would say that for First Nations, the energy system on the coast was one based on the energy of rivers and salmon and grease trails. They're all connected and they underpin a whole social network. And it's an interface with nature, and it has to do with wealth, it has to do with social organization, it has to do with cultural structures, and it has technologies and tools associated with it. Every energy system has something like that. And energy began to change in British Columbia in the 1840s in the fur trade. in a debate over whether or not to use a steam-powered ship on the coast, which required people to cut wood up and down the coast to feed the boilers. Or should they remain creatures of wind and waves, sailing ships? And that was actually one of our first energy debates. It was between John McLaughlin and Sir George Simpson. And the SS Beaver, which wrecked in Vancouver Harbor in 1888, is the ship they were arguing about. Is it more efficient to create the energies needed for that new technology or not? The world itself carries on with that debate. And so this project is about drawing all of those case studies together as chapters in a book. And my function here is to not write the definitive book on steam, which Bob Turner, one of our retired curators, is working on, or the best book ever on coal mining, or the best book ever on pipelines. It's to give the public something to think about these debates we're engaged in today, which tend to focus on energy. And what happened, not just today, but what happened in the past when different energy systems were competing for dominance in our resource economy and in our social economy. And these moments have macro levels, big scale changes, and micro levels. So the stove is micro level. The hydrogen flashlight is micro level. But for the 2010 Olympics, the plan was to build a hydrogen highway from Vancouver Airport, including hydrogen-powered vehicles that would dock the planes at the airport, and hydrogen-powered buses with hydrogen fuel stations taking the guests to the 2010 Olympics all the way up to Whistler on a hydrogen highway was the phrase that was used by Premier Campbell. And it was seen at a macro level as something that he saw eye to eye with the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, about putting a hydrogen technology up the Pacific coast of North America. Did it work? Yeah. But it's one example of these ideas about envisioning our future, and it's an example that's represented in our collection. So I'm taking the idea that Vaclav Semel has about energy systems, but I'm looking at it as social and cultural history. And I'm looking at it at a macro level, which for me tends to be industrial use, and at a micro level, what does it mean to you and I in our daily lives? We have an example of a stove that was converted from coal to natural gas in Vancouver in the 1950s. A family decided to pay the money to buy into the new energy source. And as we talk about Tesla and all of these other ideas and solar energy and panels, we're all going to look at micro and macro level decisions about future energy systems, as well as the political debates of today. So that's really what the book is about. I'm sketching it out. Those are some examples of some of the chapters that I'm looking at. I actually have something done on oil tankers and protests, but it's from 1979, completely forgotten, when Kitimat was possibly going to be where the Alaskan oil would be landed. And that was quite an interesting sort of debate, because there was a huge debate in Washington State. So I'm also dipping occasionally into the US sources. And that's certainly true in the example of the Trans-Canada Pipeline, natural gas in 1952. A lot of people have forgotten that it was held up for 2 years by debates in Washington, D.C. Washington State did not want to import Canadian gas. And the person behind it, the McMahon brothers, that's McMahon Stadium in Calgary for the Grey Cup and so forth. So I'm looking at those kinds of questions. When the pipeline was coming down, first to service the Fraser Valley and then to go down through Washington State to Oregon, the idea was to do a very rapid route, and Premier W.A.C. Bennett sort of looked at the whole thing and blew the whistle and said, no, I want natural gas for the Okanagan. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at. Currently, each of these have social consequences. Just look briefly in this photo on the lower left. Those are First Nation women. Their husbands and their sons are down in the bottom of a mine where there's just been an explosion. And so there are social dimensions, there are racial dimensions, there are Chinese and Japanese miners down in that particular mine, as well as English miners. So what happens if you think of the social consequences and the connections to different energy systems? When heavy oil beats out coal from Nanaimo, the mines close. What does that mean for Nanaimo? What are the implications for energy systems? And of course, they're connected to politics and policy and social debates. Mary Lou Andrews is talking about the impact inland at Seton Lake of an oil spill on the coast in terms of fisheries. This was a hearing that was held at NAMU and other locations in 1979 and deals with the first debate. There are 2 or 3 meters of transcripts that have gone through on those. And the people of Haida Gwaii at that time asked the National Energy Board for something they thought was flaky. They wanted a wind farm as an experiment. And they were talking about seeing their island system as an energy system built on tidal wave and so forth. So that's really what the project's about. I have 3 chapters, about 27,000 words so far, an outline, a book proposal that's been accepted for publication, and over the next 2 years, I'll be filling in other chapters, both going forward and backward in time. To date, I've looked at early precursors of the Columbia River Treaty, the pipeline debates, the tanker debates of '79, and the natural gas pipeline of 1952, which, among other side effects, got rid of smog and fog in Vancouver as people decided which energy system, and it beat out coal and wood stoves. So Vancouver used to be called Fog City, a little less so today. Thank you.